The locket hit the floorboards of the Abilene Sheriff's office with a sound so small it barely registered over the crackling of the wood stove, and yet Silas Lawson felt it like a gunshot straight through his chest. He had ridden through 3 states to return it. 3 states. Kansas to Missouri to Texas and back again, through dust storms that swallowed whole valleys, through 2 near ambushes and 1 very bad night in a Dodge City saloon, where a man named Cutter had pressed a knife against his ribs and told him to hand over whatever he was carrying or bleed out on the sawdust floor. Silas had not handed it over. He had cracked Cutter's wrist with the butt of his Colt, paid for the man's whiskey out of something that felt distantly like guilt, and ridden on before sunrise. And now Naomi Underwood was standing 3 feet away from him in a calico dress the color of storm clouds, and she was not looking at the locket. She was looking at him with an expression he could not quite name, something wedged uncomfortably between fury and a devastation, so raw it made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "You followed me," she said. Her voice was low and precise, like a blade being drawn slow and deliberate from a sheath. "I returned your property," Silas said, and his own voice came out rougher than he intended because he had not spoken to a woman of any particular consequence in roughly 17 days, and this woman had more consequence in the set of her jaw alone than most people carried in their entire bodies. "I dropped that locket on the train intentionally," Naomi said. The sentence landed in the room and stayed there, massive and unwilling to be moved. Silas stared at her. The wood stove ticked. Outside, a horse snorted against the early March cold. "Intentionally," he repeated. "It belonged to my husband." She paused on that word, let it do its work. "My late husband. And I dropped it because I decided I was done carrying the weight of a dead man's secrets across the country in a piece of gold I never asked for." Something shifted in Silas's understanding then, cracked open in the way that a desert floor cracks when water finally finds it. And everything he had thought he understood about this errand, about why he had ridden 1,000 miles through the worst of a late winter frontier, rearranged itself into a shape he had not anticipated. He bent down, picked up the locket from where it had fallen, and set it very carefully on the sheriff's desk between them. "Then I suppose," he said, "you'd better tell me what secrets are inside it. Because I've been followed by 3 different men since Wichita who seem very interested in getting it back, and if they're willing to kill over a dead man's guilt, then you're not as done with it as you think." Naomi Underwood looked at the locket on the desk. Then she looked at Silas Lawson, and for the first time since he had walked through that door, the fury in her face gave way to something that looked, just slightly, like the beginning of trust. It had started 6 weeks earlier, on a cold February morning in St. Louis, Missouri. The Missouri Pacific Railroad ran its westbound service out of the St. Louis station at 7:45 in the morning, and on the 14th of February, 1882, Silas Lawson had been on it with no particular destination in mind, and very little in his saddlebag besides a change of clothes, a worn Bible he never read but could not bring himself to leave behind, and his Colt single-action Army revolver, which he had cleaned the night before with the focused attention of a man who has no one else to attend to. He was 29 years old. He had spent the last 4 years working as a hired gun for various interests across Kansas and Missouri, not an outlaw precisely, but not entirely removed from the world of men who operated in spaces the law could not or would not reach. He had tracked stolen cattle, found missing persons, escorted payrolls through hostile country, and once, on a job he preferred not to think about, had stood between a homesteading family and a group of land agents who believed that legal documents were suggestions and violence was a negotiating tool. He had not hurt anyone on that job, but he had made it very clear that he would, and the land agents had believed him, and the family had kept their land. He was not, by any ordinary measure, a man who made friends easily or spoke more than necessary. He had a face that people described as hard, dark hair that needed cutting, and the kind of stillness that either comforted people or unsettled them, depending on what they were carrying in their own conscience. On the train, He took a window seat in the second passenger car and watched Missouri slide past in shades of gray and brown and the early bare suggestion of spring. He was not paying particular attention to the other passengers until the woman across the aisle, approximately 2 rows forward and on his left, dropped something. She was not facing him. All he could see was the straight line of her back in a dark blue traveling coat, the dark hair pinned up under a modest hat, and the way her hands had gone very still on her lap after the drop. She did not reach down. She did not look back. She sat with a deliberateness that struck him as too controlled for an accident. He watched her for another minute. She did not move. The object, whatever it was, lay on the floor between their row and hers, catching a thin thread of winter light through the window. Silas told himself it was none of his business. He looked out the window for approximately 4 minutes before he gave up pretending and reached forward to collect the object from the floor. It was a locket, gold oval with a pattern of small engraved leaves around the edge that had been worn smooth in places by years of handling. It was the kind of thing that had weight to it beyond its actual mass, the weight of significance of having lived in someone's hand or against someone's chest for a long time. He turned it over. On the back, engraved in a fine script, "Are you to NU with love always?" Silas looked at the woman's back. She had not moved. He stood up, walked the 2 rows forward, and held the locket out into her peripheral vision. "You dropped this, ma'am." She turned then, and he saw her face for the first time. Naomi Underwood was 26 years old, with dark eyes that held a quality of watchfulness he recognized instinctively, because he possessed it himself, the quality of someone who had learned that the world required careful attention to survive it. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way that the illustrated magazines of the era celebrated beauty, all softness and studied composure. Her face was too precise for that, too alert, the kind of face that thought behind its expressions rather than merely producing them. She looked at the locket in his hand. Something crossed her face that she controlled immediately and thoroughly, but not before he caught it. Not gratitude, not relief, but something closer to resignation, as if the locket had refused to stay lost. "Thank you," she said, and her voice carried the slight formality of a woman who had been raised to be polite in all circumstances regardless of how she actually felt. She took the locket from his hand and wrapped her fingers around it in a way that suggested she had no intention of wearing it. "Silas Lawson," he said, because it seemed right to introduce himself now that he had committed to the interaction. "Naomi Underwood," she said. She looked at him with that watchful quality at full strength. "You didn't have to bring it back." "No," he agreed, "but it looked like it mattered." "It did," she said, then with a precision that suggested she was being accurate rather than confessional. "Once." He nodded and returned to his seat, and that should have been the end of it. It was not the end of it. They were 4 hours west of St. Louis when the train stopped for water at a small station outside of Warrensburg, and Silas stepped onto the platform to stretch his legs and found Naomi standing at the far end of the platform, looking west into the flat winter landscape, with the expression of someone calculating something difficult. He came to stand beside her, not close, not intruding, just occupying adjacent space in the way that people do when they are sharing a platform, and it seems more awkward to stand at a distance than at a reasonable proximity. "You are not going home," he said. It was not a question. He had an instinct for reading people's direction, literal and otherwise, and everything about her posture said westward and final, not the posture of a return. She glanced at him sideways. "What makes you say that? You have the look of someone leaving, not arriving." A pause. Then, "I am going to Abilene. I have a sister there. I have not seen her in 4 years. Another pause, shorter. "My husband died 8 months ago." "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in the plain way that a person means it when they recognize genuine loss without needing the details. "He was not a good man," Naomi said, with the evenness of someone who has processed this truth past the point of needing to be angry about it. "He was charming, and for a time I believed that charm was the same thing as goodness. It took me longer than it should have to understand they are not the same thing at all." Silas said nothing. He had found over the years that silence was frequently more useful than speech, particularly when someone was telling you something real. "The locket," Naomi continued, looking back out at the flat horizon, "was a wedding gift. His initials and mine. He told me it represented his permanent devotion. A sound that was almost but not quite a laugh. I found out after he died that the initials on the back, RU to NU, the RU stood for Richard Underwood, his father. He gave me a locket that had belonged to his mother, which had presumably been given to his mother by his father. He did not have a new one made for me. He simply passed on his mother's jewelry and told me it was a symbol of his love." "That's," Silas began and stopped. "Emblematic," Naomi supplied, dry as Kansas in July. "I was going to say small," Silas said. "But emblematic is better." She looked at him then fully, and something in her expression changed in a way that was small but significant, the way a key changes when it finds a lock. "You have a dry sense of humor for a man who looks like he has never smiled in his life." "I smile," Silas said. "I am selective about it." "That is also emblematic," she said, and this time the sound she made was unmistakably close to a laugh, brief and real, and it did something to the quality of the air between them that Silas noticed and deliberately did not examine. The train whistle blew. They got back on board. For the rest of the day's ride they talked. Not constantly, not with the breathless urgency of people who have been starved for conversation, but with the particular ease of two people who discover that the silences between their words are comfortable rather than awkward. She told him about St. Louis, about the 4 years she had spent trying to make a marriage work that had been built on a series of small deceptions she had not recognized as deceptions until too many had accumulated to ignore. He told her about Kansas, about the work he had done, and the parts of it he was proud of and the parts he was not. He did not tell her everything. She did not tell him everything. But what they told each other was true, and in 1882 in the West, truth between strangers on a train was rarer and more valuable than most people acknowledged. When the train reached Kansas City at dusk, it stopped for the night. Passengers disembarked to find accommodations at the station hotel or nearby boarding houses. Silas had intended to continue west in the morning, though he had not articulated to himself precisely why. He had no job waiting in Abilene. He had no particular reason to go there. He was a man between engagements, which in his line of work meant he was a man in a transitional state that could tip toward danger if he let it. But the truth, which he admitted to himself only at the level of awareness just below conscious thought, was that he had found the conversation on the train more engaging than anything he had experienced in several months, and he was not in any great hurry to end it. They parted at the station with a nod and a polite exchange of good evenings, and that too should have been the end of it. And again it was not, because at breakfast the following morning in the station dining room Naomi Underwood was at a table near the window, and when she saw him she gestured to the empty chair across from her in a way that was casual and matter-of-fact, not flirtatious, not weighted. Just a practical recognition that they were two people who had already established they could share space without it becoming a problem. He sat down. They ordered coffee. Outside, snow had begun to fall on Kansas City in thin, indifferent curtains. "I had a thought last night," Naomi said, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. "About what?" "About why I keep the locket." She set the cup down and looked at the table for a moment. "I think I've been carrying it as a kind of evidence, as if I need proof that it was real, that I wasn't foolish to have believed in it, that there was at least something there at the beginning even if it became something else. Proof for whom, I don't know, perhaps for myself." "That's not foolish," Silas said. "It is a little foolish. It's human," he said, "which is different." She looked at him with that full attention again. "You are a more considered man than you appear." "What do I appear to be?" She studied him with a frankness that might have been rude from someone else, but from her felt simply like honesty. "You appear to be a man who has decided that the world is a series of problems to be solved, and that emotion is a complication rather than a resource. You appear to have built a considerable distance between yourself and other people, and to maintain it with some determination. You appear to be someone who was hurt badly enough at some point that you concluded the hurt was the cost of closeness, and you decided the cost was not worth it. The snow fell outside. Silas did not speak for a moment. "You are perceptive," he said finally. "I had 4 years of marriage to a man who hid things," Naomi said simply. "I learned to read what people don't say. And what is it that I'm not saying?" "That you're lonely," she said, without inflection, without pity, just accuracy. "Not in a way that distresses you exactly, but in a way that has become so familiar you've stopped noticing it. Like a noise in the walls that you've lived with long enough that you no longer hear it, but it hasn't gone away." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee and drank and said, "The train leaves at 9. "I know," she said. "I'll walk you to the platform," he said. She smiled. It was the first full smile he had seen from her, and it rearranged the geometry of his morning considerably. The train to Abilene was smaller and slower than the Missouri Pacific, a regional line that wound through the Kansas prairie with all the urgency of a man who has nowhere pressing to be. It suited the landscape. Kansas in February was a study in the infinite, flat and gray and enormous, the sky taking up 3/4 of any given view, and the land below it looking patient in the way that only very old things can look patient. It was a landscape that either broke people or made them very quiet and deeply themselves. Naomi sat beside him this time, not across the aisle, and neither of them commented on this adjustment. They read, separately, for an hour. She had a copy of a Harper's Monthly from December of the previous year. He had a territorial newspaper from Kansas City that he had bought at the station. Occasionally one of them said something about what they were reading, and the other responded, and the conversation bloomed briefly and then settled back into comfortable quiet. It was mid-morning when she opened the locket. He was not watching her, but he was aware of her in the peripheral way he was aware of most things in his vicinity, and he noticed the movement, the small click of the locket opening. He did not look directly. After a moment she said quietly, "There is something inside it I should tell you about." He put down the paper. Inside the locket, folded so small it was barely a sliver of paper, was a note. Naomi unfolded it with the careful movements of someone who has unfolded it many times. The paper was worn soft at the creases. "I found this 6 weeks after Richard died," she said. "I had not opened the locket in years because I preferred not to think about it. But I was sorting through his things and I found the key to his study, and inside his study I found a letter that referred to the locket, specifically to something hidden inside it, and that was when I discovered that what I thought was a sentiment was actually a record." Silas waited. "Richard was involved with men who bought and sold land claims in ways that were not entirely legal," Naomi said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not entirely. "He was a land speculator. He had arrangements with certain officials in the Missouri State Office to redirect homestead claims away from the settlers who had filed them, and toward investors who paid Richard and those officials for the service. He kept records of these arrangements, names, dates, amounts. The men he worked with are still operating. Some of them are quite powerful." She held up the paper. "This is an account number and a code that references a ledger he kept. The ledger is in Abilene with my sister, though she does not know what it is. She only knows that Richard sent it to her for safekeeping a month before he died and asked her to keep it until Naomi came for it." Silas was very still. "The men Richard worked with want this," Naomi said. "They have been looking for it since he died. They searched our house in St. Louis. They approached me 3 times with various pretexts, asking about his papers, his records, his personal effects. They were polite. They were the kind of men who are polite the way a knife is polished. It makes it look better but does not make it safer." "And you decided to go west to retrieve the ledger," Silas said. "I decided," Naomi said carefully, "to go west to give the ledger to someone who could use it properly. A federal marshal. Someone outside the reach of the men Richard worked with." She paused. There is a federal marshal in Abilene named Harrison who has been investigating land fraud in Kansas for 2 years. My sister wrote to me about him. He is known to be honest, which in 1882 is a specific and notable quality. Silas looked at the locket. He looked at the note. He looked at Naomi, who was watching him with the expression of someone who has told a difficult truth and is waiting to find out what it costs her. "And the reason you dropped the locket on the train," he said slowly, "was not because you had decided to stop carrying the weight of a dead man's secrets." "No," she said. "I dropped it because I noticed a man watching me from the car behind us. He got on at Warrensburg. He has been watching me since St. Louis. I dropped the locket because I wanted him to see me drop something, and if he retrieved it, he would have found only the locket and not realized that what he was looking for was the note inside it, which I had already removed and placed in the lining of my coat." A pause. She met his eyes. "I intended to retrieve the locket at the next station. I did not intend for a stranger to retrieve it first and then follow me halfway across the state to return it." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does the man from Warrensburg look like?" "Medium height, gray coat, hat with a bent left brim. He has a way of standing very still when he thinks no one is watching him." Silas nodded once precisely with the slightly grim recognition of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion. "He got off at Kansas City," he said, "but he sent a telegram before he did." Naomi's hands went still on the paper. "You saw this." "I have a habit of noticing men who are watching people," Silas said. "Occupational requirement. Then someone else may be waiting for me in Abilene. It's possible." She folded the note with those careful movements and tucked it back into the locket, then closed it with a precise click. She looked out the window at the endless Kansas plains rolling by under a sky that had shifted from gray to a thin, watery blue. "I did not intend to involve anyone else in this," she said. "I know," Silas said, "and yet here we are." "And yet here we are," he agreed. Outside, the prairie stretched to every horizon in every direction. A small creek caught the thin sun and for a moment was very bright. A hawk tilted overhead and then was gone. "I should tell you something," Silas said, "about why I was on that train." She looked at him. "I was between engagements," he said. "No job, no particular destination. I've been doing that for about a year, moving between work and not being able to commit to anything that required me to stay in one place. I have been called many things in my profession: a hired gun, a regulator, a troubleshooter. The honest word is a man who is good at managing danger and has no other notable skill." "I would argue you have other notable skills," Naomi said. "Observation, silence at the right moments, coffee in the morning without needing to fill it with conversation. Those are not skills one lists for potential employers. They are skills one notices nonetheless." A pause. "Why have you been unable to stay in one place?" He thought about how much to say. He thought about what she had said on the platform in Kansas City about loneliness and the noise in the walls and the cost of closeness. "I had a partner," he said. "A man named Del Reeve, who was my age and who I had worked with for 6 years. We were not friends precisely, but we were the kind of people who trust each other with their lives on a regular basis, which is something beyond friendship. He was killed last spring on a job we had both agreed to take, a bad job badly planned. I was not there when it happened. I had argued against taking it and eventually been persuaded and then been delayed, and by the time I arrived he was dead." He said it plainly, the way he had taught himself to say it, without the weight that it still carried but that he had decided was not available for public display. "You blame yourself," Naomi said. "I was not there." "That is not the same as blame." "No," he said, "but it is adjacent to it." She was quiet for a moment. The train rocked gently on the tracks. Somewhere in the car ahead, a child was asking its mother a series of unanswerable questions about why the sky was that particular color. "I think," Naomi said carefully, "that you and I have both been carrying things that belong to other people's failings. Your partner's death was the result of a bad job badly planned, which is not your fault, and my husband's corruption is the result of his choices, which are not my fault either. and yet both of us have been carrying them as if they were." Silas looked at her for a long moment. The train rocked. The prairie slid past. "You are a very direct person," he said. "I spent 4 years being careful about what I said in my own house," Naomi replied. "I find that I am not inclined to be careful anymore." The train rolled into Abilene at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the light long and gold and cold across the famous town, which was by 1882 somewhat past its wildest years, but still carried the particular energy of a place that had been the endpoint of the Kishom Trail, that had seen more cattle and more conflict, and more of the rawest edges of frontier life than most places twice its size. The cattle trade had moved west as the railroads pushed further, but Abilene remained, settled into something more like a proper town, with its storefronts and its law offices and its 2 churches and its hotel, though the saloons remained and the cowboys still came through, and the law was still the kind of law that required a man behind it who was not afraid of what law-breaking men could do to a body. Naomi's sister was named Clara. She was 2 years younger than Naomi and had her same dark eyes but a different temperament, warmer and more openly expressive, the kind of person who communicates in exclamation points, where her sister communicated in carefully calibrated periods. She was married to a hardware store owner named James Whitfield, a solid and sensible man who seemed genuinely happy to see Naomi and genuinely bewildered by the tall, quiet man who came with her. "He helped me on the train," Naomi said in introduction, and left the nature of that help diplomatically undefined. Silas shook James Whitfield's hand, introduced himself, and accepted a room for the night above the hardware store because Naomi had insisted, and because he had decided, somewhere around the 200-mile mark of his acquaintance with her, that he was not going to pretend that leaving made sense when he had no destination, and there were men following her, and she had documents that dangerous people wanted. That evening, while James minded the store and Silas sat at the kitchen table cleaning his revolver with methodical attention, Naomi and Clara sat across from him, and Naomi told her sister the whole of it: the locket, the note, the ledger, Richard's corruption, the men who had been watching and following and waiting. Clara went very still as her sister talked, in the particular way of someone who is reprocessing a large amount of historical information through a new lens. "The box Richard sent," she said when Naomi finished. "The locked box he said was legal papers." "That is almost certainly the ledger," Naomi said. "It is in the back of the store," Clara said. "Under the floor behind the 3rd shelf. I put it there because James thought it was important enough to put somewhere safe, and we couldn't think of anywhere safer." "Good," Naomi said. Then, looking at Silas, "I need to contact Marshal Harrison tomorrow morning." "What does Harrison know about the men you're dealing with?" Silas asked. Clara mentioned in her letters that he has been building a case against a group of land speculators connected to state offices in Missouri, Kansas, and Texas. "He has names but lacks documentation. Then the ledger is what completes his case." "That is my understanding." Silas set the cleaned revolver on the table with a soft, deliberate click. "Then we go to Harrison tomorrow morning, first thing before we retrieve the box so that he can arrange to secure it properly. I don't want to walk through Abilene with that box in hand until there is a marshal present." Naomi looked at him steadily. "You do not have to be involved in this." "You keep saying that," Silas said, "because it keeps being true." "What is also true," he said, "is that I am involved. I have been involved since I picked up a locket off the floor of a train in Missouri, and I would rather be involved with a plan than involved without one." Clara looked between the two of them with the bright, observant eyes of a younger sister who has spent considerable time reading people, and is currently reading something that amuses and moves her in roughly equal measure. She said nothing, which showed considerable restraint. That night, Silas could not sleep. He lay on the narrow cot in the room above the store and listened to Abilene settle into its nighttime sounds. A piano from the saloon 2 blocks down, the intermittent conversation of men on the main street, A dog somewhere answering a dog somewhere else. The wind had picked up after dark and was moving through the town with purpose. He thought about Naomi Underwood. He thought about the way she had said she was not inclined to be careful anymore. He thought about the noise in the walls she had described, the loneliness she had named in him that he had not named in himself. He thought about the fact that she was 3 doors down the hall and that he was aware of this in a way that was inconvenient, and also, he admitted in the dark, not entirely unwelcome. He had not let himself want anything that was not transactional in approximately 3 years. He had convinced himself that this was a kind of peace, the absence of desire, the simplification of a life down to its practical components. What he was discovering, lying on a cot in Abilene, Kansas, on a cold February night with the wind working at the windows, was that what he had called peace might more accurately be called a long negotiated truce with his own interior, and that the truce was showing significant signs of breaking down. He got up before dawn, dressed quietly, went downstairs, and made a fire in the kitchen stove. He had found a bag of coffee and a pot the previous evening, and he put the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window and watched the very early light begin to work its way along the eastern edge of the world. Naomi came down 20 minutes later, which did not surprise him. She was wearing a different dress, dark green, and her hair was not fully pinned yet, loose around her face in a way that was different from her traveling composure. She stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment when she saw him, and then she came in and poured herself coffee and stood beside him at the window. "I thought about what you said," she said, "about Del Reeve. You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to." She looked at the early light. "I wanted you to know that I think the guilt you carry is the guilt of someone who believes that loyalty should make you omnipresent, that you should have been there. But you are one man, and no amount of loyalty makes a man 2 places at once." Silas was quiet for a moment. The coffee was hot in his hands. "My father used to say that the weight we carry for other people is a measure of how much we valued them," he said finally. He was a preacher. He had a talent for making things sound right even when the logic didn't entirely hold. "Do you miss him?" "He died when I was 12, so it's been a while." A pause. "But yes. I miss the version of a father a 12-year-old believes in, which is probably not the entirely accurate one." "I think that is the most personal thing you have said to me," Naomi said. "You have that effect," Silas said. He did not say it with particular inflection. He said it the way he said most things, evenly, and yet the words sat between them in the morning light with a warmth that the kitchen stove had not entirely created. Naomi looked at him. He looked at her. The light was coming up now, touching the tops of the wooden buildings across the alley with gold. "We should go to Harrison," she said. "Yes," he said. "After this coffee." "After this coffee," he agreed. Marshall Harrison was a lean, angular man in his mid-40s, who had the look of someone who had been working on something difficult for a long time and had not yet allowed himself to believe he was close to finishing it. He received them in his office at 7:30 in the morning with the alertness of a man who never truly stopped working, and he listened to Naomi without interrupting, which was the quality Silas liked most about him from the outset. When she finished, Harrison leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingertips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of someone doing very rapid internal calculation. Then he looked at them both. "The Cartwright Group," he said. "That's who your husband was working with. Gerald Cartwright and Associates out of St. Louis. We have been working on them for 18 months. We have depositions and circumstantial documentation, but we have not had access to their own internal records because those records are what Cartwright uses to control the people who work for him. Everyone is compromised. Everyone has something in those records they don't want a federal court to see." "Including Richard," Naomi said. "Including your husband, yes, Mrs. Underwood, I'm sorry for that." "I am past being surprised by it," she said, evenly. Harrison nodded. "I will need to take possession of that ledger under federal authority. I will also need a deputy present for the retrieval to maintain chain of evidence. And I need to tell you that Cartwright will have people in Abilene." He has resources and he has been tracking that ledger since your husband died. We know, Silas said. She was followed from St. Louis. Harrison looked at Silas with the assessing gaze of a lawman cataloging what he is dealing with. And you are? Silas Lawson. I was on the train. I have been helping Mrs. Underwood. You are the Silas Lawson who tracked the McAllister gang across 3 counties last year for the Sedgwick County Sheriff. I am. Harrison nodded, very slightly, the nod of a man making a decision. I could use someone with your skill set for the next 12 hours, Mr. Lawson. The retrieval, the transfer of evidence to the federal office, and the security of Mrs. Underwood and her sister. Are you available? Silas glanced at Naomi. She was looking at him with her direct, steady gaze, not asking anything, just present. He turned back to Harrison. I'm available, he said. What happened next in the middle hours of that February day was a precisely organized operation that went reasonably well right up until the moment it did not. The retrieval itself went smoothly. Harrison and his deputy went ahead to the hardware store, confirmed the locked box under the floor behind the 3rd shelf, and documented it formally with a written record of the date, time, and location. The box was heavy and well-made and had a lock that had not been opened since Richard Underwood had sealed it. And when Harrison finally opened it with the key that Naomi provided from the note in the locket, the ledger inside was exactly what they had hoped. A detailed record of fraudulent land transfers, names and dates and amounts, and coded references to officials in 3 state governments. The trouble came on the walk back to the federal office. There were 2 of them, and they came from the alley beside the dry goods store, and the fact that they had been willing to make a move in the middle of the day on a main street said something about how badly Cartwright wanted the ledger and how little concern he had for the kind of subtlety that took into account the presence of a federal marshal. The first man went directly for Harrison. The second went for Naomi. Silas had been watching the alleys. He had positioned himself on Naomi's right with a clear sightline to the most probable approach routes, because he had assessed the town that morning on the walk to Harrison's office and identified the 3 places he would come from if he were coming. The alley by the dry goods store was the second on his list. He moved before the second man reached Naomi, placing himself between them in 2 long steps, and the confrontation that followed was brief and unpleasant, and ended with the second man sitting against the dry goods store wall, holding a wrist that was not working correctly and in no condition to continue. Harrison, for his part, had handled the first man with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 30 years, and had lost patience for men who underestimated the alertness of federal marshals. Naomi, who had not screamed and had not frozen, was standing very upright against the wall of the adjacent building with her hands at her sides, and an expression that was controlled and fierce and just slightly shaken in the way that a person is shaken when something violent happens close to them regardless of how composed they are. She was looking at Silas. "Are you hurt?" he said immediately. "No," she said. "Are you?" "No." Harrison had his deputy secure both men with cuffs and send for additional help. He looked at Silas and Naomi and then at the ledger, which was under his arm and entirely undamaged. "We need to get this to the federal office now," he said. "Both of you come with me." That evening, with the ledger safely in federal custody and Harrison's official protection formally arranged, Silas and Naomi sat in Clara and James's kitchen again with coffee and the particular quality of stillness that follows a high-tension afternoon. Clara had been informed of the events of the day and had responded with a combination of profound relief and a very immediate need to cook something substantial, which had produced a chicken stew that now sat on the table between them, warming the room. Clara had the wisdom to take herself and James to the front room after dinner, with the transparency of a woman who understands a moment when she sees one. Silas and Naomi sat with their coffee in the quiet kitchen, and the wind outside had settled, and the stove clicked and ticked as wood shifted to coals. "Thank you," Naomi said finally. "It was a straightforward situation," Silas said. Nothing about today was straightforward, she said. You could have been hurt. Could have been. That does not concern you. He considered this with the genuine thoughtfulness he gave to most questions that were really asking something else. I have been in many situations where I could have been hurt, he said. What concerned me today was that you could have been hurt. That is a different concern. Naomi looked at her coffee cup. A small smile crossed her face that she did not entirely control. You are doing it again, she said. Doing what? Saying something that is more than you intend to say. Maybe, he said. I intend exactly as much as I say. She looked up at him then, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the kitchen was very warm and very quiet, and whatever had been building between them since a train platform in Kansas City was doing something that could not be precisely defined but also could not be ignored. I don't know what happens now, Naomi said. I have not thought past this. For 8 months everything has been about Richard and the things he left behind and the men who wanted them, and now the marshal has the ledger and those men are in custody, and I am in my sister's kitchen in Abilene, Kansas, and I genuinely do not know what comes next. What do you want to come next? Silas asked. She thought about this for a long moment. I want to stay somewhere long enough to remember what it feels like to not be moving. I want to sleep through a night without listening for footsteps. I want to stop being Richard Underwood's widow and become whatever else I am. She paused. I want to see what this landscape looks like in spring. Clara says the prairie in April is extraordinary. It is, Silas said. She looked at him. Have you ever stayed somewhere long enough to see it? Not in recent years, he said. I've been the other kind of man, the moving kind. And is that what you want to continue being? The question was direct and clear, and she had asked it the way she asked everything, without artful hiding, without softness to deflect the impact. It landed in the room between them and asked for a real answer. Silas looked at her for a moment. He looked at the table, at his coffee, at the stove. He looked back at her. No, he said. I don't think I want to continue being that kind of man. The smile that came over Naomi's face then was not the brief, controlled expression she had offered him on the train, not the careful small allowances of a woman who had learned to manage her own visibility. It was a full smile, warm and real and a little surprised, as if she had asked a question with some expectation that the answer would be other than it was, and had been genuinely delighted to be wrong. Good, she said. In the weeks that followed, Abilene did what small frontier towns do when the dramatic business has been settled, and ordinary life reasserts its rhythm. Marshal Harrison formally filed the evidence with the federal court in Topeka. The 2 men captured on the street were identified as associates of the Cartwright group and held for trial. Gerald Cartwright himself, confronted with the contents of Richard's ledger, made the decision that powerful men sometimes make when they realize their position is indefensible, which was to negotiate aggressively for reduced charges rather than face the full enumeration of his crimes in open court. The case took months to fully resolve, as federal cases did, but the ledger's delivery was the pivotal event that made the resolution possible, and Harrison made clear in his official report that Naomi Underwood had delivered it at considerable personal risk, and that her husband's corruption should be legally distinguished from her own clear integrity. This mattered more than it might have seemed. In 1882, a woman's reputation was bound to her husband's in ways that could be practically and socially devastating, and the official record establishing her as the person who had exposed the corruption rather than profited from it was a form of justice that Naomi accepted with the quiet relief of someone who had not known how much they needed it until it arrived. Silas did not leave Abilene. He did not make a dramatic declaration about this. He simply remained. He found occasional work with the local law office, a kind of deputy arrangement without the official title, helping Harrison with the final stages of the Cartwright case, and occasionally providing the kind of steadying presence that a frontier town's law enforcement appreciated. He found a room at a boarding house on the west side of town run by a widow named Mrs. Ecker, who was 60 years old and took no nonsense from anyone and made the best biscuits in Kansas. which was a genuine qualification. He called on Naomi at the hardware store and at Clara's house with a regularity that was visible enough that Abilene, which was a town of several hundred people and excellent social memory, noticed and catalogued. Clara noticed and said several things about it that were warm and entirely unhelpful. James Whitfield shook Silas's hand more firmly each time he saw him, which was James's version of enthusiastic approval. The courtship, which was the word for it, though neither of them used the word initially, had the quality that both of their personalities demanded. It was honest, it was direct, it built without pretense on conversations that continued the ones they had begun on the train. He taught her to shoot. This had a practical component. The Cartwright case was not entirely closed, and she had identified a desire to not be in the position of depending entirely on someone else's capacity for defense again. And it also had, neither of them said this directly, a quality of shared attention. Of standing very close in the early morning on the edge of town, with his hands correcting the angle of her grip, and her absolute refusal to be startled by the noise of the shot that told him more about her determination than anything she had said in words. She told him, over time, the things she had not told him on the train. About the early years of her marriage, when she had believed in Richard and in the life she was building, when the small deceptions had seemed like small things, insufficient to define a person or a marriage. About the years when the small things had accumulated into something she could no longer rationalize away. About the particular loneliness, different from his own loneliness but recognizable to him in its shape, of being isolated within a relationship rather than outside one. He told her about his childhood in a small Missouri town, about a father who preached grace on Sundays and struggled with a difficult temper on the days in between, about a mother who had died when he was 8 and who he remembered primarily as a warmth and a smell rather than a face, about the man who had taken him under his guidance at 17 and taught him how to handle himself in the spaces between legal and illegal where the frontier required pragmatic men. About Del Reeve, whom he talked about more than he had talked about with anyone, and the process of talking about Del was itself a kind of releasing, a gradual laying down of something very heavy on a surface that was solid enough to hold it. March came and went. The snow stopped. The ground softened. The sky over Kansas shifted from the flat gray of winter to the enormous, brilliant blue of a plain spring. And Naomi was right. The prairie in April was extraordinary, the land going from brown to green with a speed and completeness that felt almost aggressive, wildflowers appearing across the buffalo grass in quantities that turned the landscape into something from an illustration in a book of natural wonders. Silas walked with her on a Sunday afternoon in early April along the creek that ran east of town, the water running fast and clear from the spring melt, the cottonwoods beginning to show their pale green leaves, and they walked for an hour and talked, and then they stopped at a place where the creek bent and there was a flat-topped rock in the sun, warm in the afternoon light, and they sat on it and were quiet for a while, listening to the water. "I want to tell you something," Silas said. "Tell me," she said. "I have been trying to find the right way to say it for several weeks," he said, which was an admission that cost him something. "I am not practiced at this." "I know you are not," she said, with the gentle precision that was distinctive to her, the way she could be direct without being unkind. "I also know you are trying. I see the trying." He looked at the creek. He looked at her. He had faced men with guns in dark alleys and managed it with something that looked like equanimity. This was harder. "I am in love with you," he said. "I want you to know that clearly, without any of the hedging I am inclined toward, because you deserve clarity and I am capable of providing it when I commit to it." Naomi looked at him for a long moment with those dark, steady eyes. Then she did something he had not expected. She reached over and took his hand, the calloused, careful hands of a man who worked with them and had learned to keep them very still, and she held it in both of hers, and she said, "I know. You know. I have known for some time," she said. "I was waiting for you to know that you knew. You are a man who requires a certain amount of verification before you trust what you observe. That is extremely accurate and mildly humbling, he said. And I love you, she said. Which I suspect you also knew and were also waiting to verify. He was quiet for a moment. The creek ran on below them. A red-tailed hawk curved high overhead in the enormous blue sky. He turned his hand in hers so that he was holding her hand rather than her holding his, and the feeling of it, the simple warm fact of her hand in his in the afternoon sun, was something he did not have adequate language for, and so he did not attempt language. He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly against his lips, a gesture that was quiet and deliberate and entirely his own. I want to ask you to marry me, he said, but I want to ask you properly. And I want to ask with the understanding that I mean it, that I am not Richard Underwood, that what I say is what I intend and nothing else. I know you are not Richard, she said. I have known that since the train. She looked at him steadily. Ask me properly then. Not today, he said. Not on a rock by a creek because we happened to stop here. I want it to be deliberate. I want you to know I planned it. She looked at him for a moment and then she laughed, the full real laugh he had heard only rarely and never tired of, bright and entirely genuine. You are the most deliberate man I have ever met, she said. Is that a complaint? It is the opposite of a complaint, she said. He did plan it. He spent a week planning it, which involved a conversation with James Whitfield that was more emotionally complex than any gunfight he had participated in, and a visit to the town jeweler, and a consultation with Clara that he had not intended to make, but which Clara engineered through a series of maneuvers so subtle he did not realize he had been managed until after the fact, when she had provided him with information about Naomi's preferences regarding jewelry that proved extremely useful. The ring he chose was a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone, the turquoise a deep sky blue that reminded him, he admitted only to himself, of the color the prairie sky had been on the afternoon they had sat on the rock by the creek. The jeweler, an older German man named Herr Brandt who had been in Abilene since 1870 and had seen the town through its wildest years, examined Silas's selection with the approval of a craftsman whose work was being treated with appropriate respect. He asked her on a Friday evening in early May, when the prairie was at its most spectacular, the evening light going golden and long across the grass, the whole landscape lit as if from within. He had told her he wanted to walk that evening, and she had agreed without question, and they had walked out of town and across the low rise to the south where the land opened up in every direction, and the sky was enormous and clear. He stopped and turned to face her, and she looked at him with the knowing expression of someone who had been observing him closely for 3 months, and had a fairly clear idea of what was happening. He did not make a speech. He took the ring from his pocket and held it and said, Naomi Underwood, I want to spend my life with you. I want to be deliberate about you in the way I have not been deliberate about anything in a long time. I want to build something that stays in one place and grows over time. I'm asking you to marry me. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. The light was very gold, very warm. The wind was gentle across the grass, and the prairie was immense and silent and present in the way it always was, patient and enormous and indifferent to human complications in a way that was, paradoxically, deeply comforting. Yes, she said. She said it without hesitation, without qualification. The word was clear and complete as the horizon. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it for a moment, the blue stone against her skin in the evening light. Then she looked up at him, and he stepped forward and kissed her for the first time, there in the May prairie, and it was the kind of kiss that is simultaneously a beginning and a recognition, the feeling that this is not the start of something entirely new but the arrival at something that was always intended, a homecoming rather than a departure. They were married in June. The wedding was small by design, not because they lacked people who wished them well, but because both of them had a preference for meaning over spectacle, and a small wedding in Clara's parlor with Clara and James and Marshall Harrison and Mrs. Ecker from the boarding house and Herr Brandt the jeweler, who cried openly and without apology during the ceremony, was precisely the right size for what it was. The minister was a young man from the Methodist Church who had been in Abilene for only a year, and who looked slightly intimidated by the quality of attention that both Silas and Naomi brought to the vows, as if they were not reciting promises so much as making legally binding declarations of fact. The vows, standard in their language but not in the way they were delivered, were spoken by both of them with a directness and a certainty that made Clara's eyes fill, and made James Whitfield clear his throat 3 times in rapid succession and look at the ceiling. Afterward, over a dinner that Clara and Mrs. Ecker had collaborated on, and that was extraordinary by any standard, Silas sat beside his wife at the table and was aware of a quality of interior ease that he had no ready category for, having been without it for so long. It was not the absence of tension, not merely relief. It was something more active than that, a positive presence, a warmth that did not require maintenance or management. Naomi, beside him, was talking to Harrison about the Cartwright case's progress, asking the specific and informed questions of someone who had been directly involved and wanted to know the outcome fully. She had a glass of wine in her hand, and the blue turquoise ring on her finger, and the air of a woman who has, after considerable difficulty, arrived at a place that is genuinely hers. He watched her and thought about the train, about a gold locket on a dirty floor, about the fact that he had spent 29 years being the kind of man who picked up dropped things, and this time, by some particular grace of circumstance, the dropped thing had led him here. The Cartwright case concluded in September of 1882, with Gerald Cartwright accepting a plea arrangement that resulted in his removal from all land dealings and a substantial financial penalty, and several of his associates receiving prison terms. The officials in the Missouri State Office who had been complicit were removed from their positions and faced separate proceedings. Harrison, in a letter to Naomi that was both formal and genuinely warm, wrote that the ledger had been the decisive element, and that the case had been built substantially on her courage in bringing it forward. She read the letter at the kitchen table of the house they had rented on the west side of Abilene, a modest but solid 2-story structure with a porch that faced south and caught the afternoon sun, and when she finished she folded it carefully and set it beside her coffee cup with the look of someone who has closed a very important door behind them, gently but firmly and with full intention. "Is it done?" Silas asked from across the table. "It is done," she said. She looked at him. "Completely and entirely done." "Good," he said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his. Silas's work changed after the marriage, not dramatically but meaningfully. He continued to work with Harrison on the occasional case that required someone with his particular skills, but he also began work of a different kind, more local, less peripatetic. He helped a neighboring rancher manage a water rights dispute that had been threatening to become violent, and he helped the local bank investigate a series of forged promissory notes. And he did these things with the quality of a man who is working for the place he lives in rather than moving through it, and the difference was perceptible to him in ways that were sometimes startling in their depth. Naomi, meanwhile, found a use for her own considerable skills and education. She had been formally schooled in St. Louis, better educated than most women of her era and considerably better read, and she discovered in Abilene a school that was badly in need of a teacher, the previous teacher having left for Colorado in the spring. She took the position in September, which required a certain amount of bureaucratic navigation, given that the School Board of Abilene in 1882 held views about married women teaching that were common to the era, and not entirely rational. But Naomi Lawson, as she now was, had developed over the preceding 9 months a relationship with the concept of other people's unreasonable positions that was patient and strategic and ultimately effective. By October, she was teaching 23 children in the schoolhouse on the north end of town, and she was, by all available accounts, extraordinary at it. In the spring of 1883, a Sunday morning, Naomi told him. They were on the south porch in the early light, Silas with coffee, Naomi with tea because she had been finding coffee slightly difficult for the past several weeks, a detail she had been observing with a combination of scientific interest and cautious internal calculation. "I believe we are expecting a child," she said. She said it the way she said important things, directly and clearly, though he could hear the particular quality of feeling behind it, the complex mixture of wonder and hope, and the slight uncertainty that came from knowing that wanting something very much means having something very much to lose. Silas was quiet for a moment. He set his coffee cup down on the porch railing and turned to look at her, and whatever was on his face in that moment was sufficient to tell her something about what was happening inside him, because her own face changed in response, went warm and open in the way it only did for him, the expression she reserved for when they were alone. "When?" he said. "Late summer. Early September, perhaps." He reached for her hand and held it, and they sat with that for a moment, the morning light on the prairie, the enormous Kansas sky beginning to shift from the pink of sunrise to its daylight blue. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "A little," she said with her customary precision. "But the good kind of afraid, the kind that comes from caring about something." "I understand that kind," he said. "I know you do," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly against his lips, the same gesture he had made on the rock by the creek a year ago, and she recognized it as his most direct expression of feeling, the one he used when words were insufficient or when he wanted to bypass words entirely and communicate at a more fundamental level. The child arrived in the first week of September, 1883, in the house on the west side of Abilene, with a doctor present and Clara in attendance, and James Whitfield pacing the front porch in an agony of concern for his sister-in-law that was both touching and mildly comic. Silas was in the room, which was not universal practice for the era but which Naomi had requested, and Silas had not for a moment considered refusing, and he held her hand through the hours of it with the same steadiness he brought to everything that mattered. The child was a boy. He came into the world in the early afternoon, loud and definite and red-faced with the indignity of arrival, and Naomi held him against her chest and looked at him with an expression that Silas would think about for the rest of his life. Complete, full-capacity love, instantaneous and total, the look of someone meeting a person they have always known. "He has your eyes," Naomi said. "Poor creature," Silas said, and she laughed even in her exhaustion, the real full laugh, and the room was very warm and Clara was crying in the corner and even the doctor was smiling. They named him Thomas, which had been Silas's father's middle name and a name neither of them needed to explain to each other. Thomas Lawson grew in the way that children grow in frontier towns, quickly and outdoors, and with the full-spectrum education that living in a place with real stakes provides. He was a serious child, his father's quality of stillness and observation, but with his mother's directness and the quick intelligence that both of them possessed in their different registers. By the time he was 2, he was talking with the precise vocabulary of a child who is raised by a schoolteacher, which delighted his mother and caused his father a specific species of joy that he expressed through the medium of attempting to teach Thomas the rudiments of caring for a horse at an age when most children are still primarily occupied with staying upright. Clara's daughter, born 8 months after Thomas, became his earliest companion, and the two children grew up moving between the two households with the free range that small-town frontier life permitted, and the uncomplicated bond of children who have known each other since before they had language for knowing. The year 1884 brought 2 significant things to the Lawson household, a conversation and a decision. The conversation happened on a November evening, a year after Thomas's birth, when Silas and Naomi were sitting in the parlor after Thomas was in bed, the lamp low and the stove warm, the town quiet outside. Silas had been out of town for 3 days on a job for Harrison that had taken him to Wichita, a fraud case that had required his particular skills of tracking and documentation. "I don't want to keep doing work that takes me away," he said, without preamble, from across the room. Naomi looked up from the letter she was writing to look at him. "I was in Wichita for 3 days," he said, "and for 3 days I thought about Thomas and about you and the degree to which the feeling of being away from you is the opposite of every feeling I had in the years before I met you. In those years, being away from any fixed point was the neutral state. Now the neutral state is here, and being away from it is the departure. You could do more local work," she said. "Harrison would understand. He has appreciated your help, but the federal cases take you far." "There is work here," Silas said. "The county is growing. There is talk of expanding the law office. Harrison mentioned a deputy position that would be permanent and local." He paused. "I'm considering asking for it." "Then ask for it," Naomi said. "It pays less than the consulting work." "Silas," she said, with the patient directness that she had perfected over the years of knowing him, "I'm a schoolteacher with a permanent position, and we own this house, and we have no debt and no particular need for income beyond what we have. The question is not whether we can afford it. The question is whether it is what you want." "It is what I want," he said. "Then ask for it," she said, and returned to her letter. He asked for it. He got it. By the end of 1884, Silas Lawson was the deputy sheriff of Dickinson County, Kansas, working under the county sheriff, and maintaining the particular combination of steadiness and clear-eyed capability that had defined him as a hired gun and translated beautifully, it turned out, into law enforcement. He was known in Abilene as the kind of man you could call at any hour of the day or night, and who would come without complaint and handle whatever needed handling with the minimum necessary force and the maximum useful calm. The locket, in the end, found a resting place it had never had while Richard Underwood was alive. Naomi did not throw it away, as she had once intended. After the case was closed and Richard's role in it was part of the formal record, and she no longer needed it as evidence of anything, she made a different decision about what to do with it. She took it to Herr Brandt the jeweler, who opened it carefully and removed the worn piece of paper that had been the note, which had already been formally photographed and submitted to the court, and existed now only as a historical artifact. He replaced the note with a small photograph, the small photographic prints of the era, a photograph of Silas and Naomi and infant Thomas taken in the summer of 1883. She had the engraving on the back changed as well, though she kept the original in addition to the new. "Below are you to NU with love always," Brandt added, "SL to NL with intention always." 1882. She told Silas about it one evening, showing him the rearranged locket, and he turned it over in his hands with the characteristic quietness that meant he was processing something that mattered to him, and he read both the old inscription and the new, and he was still for a long moment. "With intention," he said. "It seemed right for you," she said. "Love is the right word too, but for you intention is the word that means the most. Because for you, choosing something deliberately is the greatest thing you can offer it." He looked at her over the locket. There were things he might have said, the kind of things he had been slowly learning to say over the years of their marriage, the slow acquisition of the language of direct feeling that he had spent most of his life being without. But in this particular moment, the things he might have said were insufficient to the task. So he did what he did instead, closed the distance between them and held her face in his hands, and kissed her in the quiet kitchen with the lamp light warm around them, and Thomas asleep upstairs, and the Kansas night enormous and cold and indifferent outside, as the Kansas night always was, and the house and the warmth inside it belonging entirely to them. The locket went into Naomi's jewelry box, and she wore it on important days, the first day of each school year, Thomas's birthdays, the anniversary of their marriage. It became the kind of object it had never been in Richard Underwood's household, not a symbol of possession or a record of fraud or a dropped piece of calculated misdirection, but a simple archive of a life that had been built deliberately and well. Spring of 1885 brought a development that surprised both of them in its timing. A second child was coming. Naomi calculated the arrival for October, and October it proved to be, the child arriving on a crisp plains morning with the cottonwoods going gold outside the window, and Thomas, who was 2 years old and entirely certain that he was the center of all meaningful activity, being managed by Clara with the heroic patience of an aunt who loves her nephew dearly and is also quite firm with him. The second child was a girl, which delighted Thomas when the concept was explained to him through the intermediary of his father, who sat on the floor of the parlor with Thomas in his lap and told him in plain and direct language that his sister had arrived and that she was very small and would require some patience from Thomas, which was a quality his father was prepared to help him develop. "What is her name?" Thomas asked, with the focused seriousness of a 2-year-old for whom names are among the most important facts about a person. "Margaret," Silas said, "after your mother's mother." Thomas considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Margaret," he repeated carefully, testing the weight of it. "Then I can teach her things." "You can," Silas said, "when she is larger." "I will wait," Thomas said, with the particular patience of a child who has decided on a plan and is simply being strategic about the timing. The years moved in the way that good years move, which is to say with a fullness that makes them feel both complete and quick, each season distinct, and each day slightly different from the one before it in the way that a life with real presence in the world is always slightly different. The children grew in their different ways, Thomas serious and observant and increasingly handy with both horses and the careful process of understanding how things worked, Margaret talkative and intense and possessed of her mother's directness in a form that was concentrated and pure, the kind of child who at age 3 looked at a stranger at the church social and said, "You are sad about something," with such simple accuracy that the stranger, who was in fact sad about something, burst into tears. Naomi continued teaching. She was by 1886 the head teacher at the school, the board having been won over by the undeniable quality of her work, and she had developed a curriculum that incorporated not only the standard reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also the history of the region they lived in, the complicated and often painful history of the land itself. The indigenous tribes who had lived on these plains for centuries before the settlers came, the Kansa people for whom the state was named, the Comanche and Cheyenne and Arapaho, whose presence the textbooks of the era largely omitted. She taught these histories alongside the other histories, not with a revisionist agenda, but with the simple honesty that she applied to everything, that to understand where you are requires knowing who was there before you and what was done to them. This was not universally popular. The school board had opinions about the curriculum. Naomi engaged with these opinions the way she engaged with everything that required changing, with patience and precision, and the capacity to hold her position without heat, but also without movement. By the time the board came around to her perspective, which they did gradually and somewhat resentfully over the course of 2 years, they had also come to recognize that parents were sending their children to the Abilene school specifically because of the quality of the teacher, and that this was an argument that transcended the curriculum debate. Silas, for his part, watched his wife's management of the school board with the open admiration of a man who has come to recognize the nature of a specific and extraordinary skill when he sees it deployed with full effect. He told her this on several occasions, in his direct way. She received it in her direct way, which was to say thank you and mean it without deflection. In 1887, the Lawson family acquired a small ranch 2 miles south of town, bought from a homesteader who was heading to Colorado to try his luck at silver mining. The house was larger than the one in town, with a wide porch on 3 sides and a good barn and a well that had never gone dry. Silas repaired and improved it over the course of a spring and summer with the focused competence of a man who has decided that a place matters and is worth his effort. And Naomi hung curtains and planted a kitchen garden and put her books on shelves in the room that became her study, and stood on the south porch on an October morning looking out at the plains that she had first seen as a winter landscape from a train and said, "This is right. This is exactly right." Thomas was 4 by then, and Margaret was almost 2, and the house was loud with them on most days and quiet only after they were in bed, when Silas and Naomi sat on the porch in the late evenings, in summer with the stars overhead in the quantities that only the plains far from cities provide, in winter by the stove inside with the wind working at the walls and the lamp making everything amber and warm. They had reached, by these years, the particular quality of relationship that is the least cinematic and the most profound, the ordinary deep intimacy of two people who have made a genuine choice of each other and have gone on choosing it across the ordinary and extraordinary events of years. They argued, occasionally, about real things with the complete engagement of two people who are not afraid of conflict, because they trust it to resolve without damage, and the arguments were sharp and honest, and usually over quickly, because they had both learned enough of each other's thinking to understand the other's position, even when they disagreed with it. They disagreed about money occasionally, about decisions regarding the children, about the school board, and once, memorably, about a neighbor whose fencing decisions were affecting the water access to the south pasture, which generated a discussion that lasted 3 days and was resolved when Silas and the neighbor had a conversation that was direct and not unfriendly, and produced a fair arrangement that both parties maintained. The locket continued to mean what it had come to mean. Naomi wore it on Thomas's first day of school, age 6, when he walked into the schoolhouse in Abilene with the particular composure of a child who has been raised to understand that new things require attention and not avoidance. She wore it on the day Margaret, age 4, learned to read her first complete sentence, pointing at the words in her primer, and then looking up at her mother with an expression of pure triumph that Naomi recognized immediately and completely. She wore it on the 15th anniversary of their marriage, when Silas took her to the hotel in Abilene for dinner, the same hotel that had been there when they arrived in 1882, though improved considerably over the intervening years. They sat across the table from each other at a proper linen-covered table and ordered from a menu and drank wine and talked, as they always talked, about everything and nothing and the specific substance of their lives. And he looked at her across the table in the candlelight and she looked at him, and neither of them said the sentimental thing about how much had changed since the train and the locket and the 3 states, though they both thought it. What Silas said instead was, "I need you to know that I am aware, specifically and continuously, that my life is better than it would have been. Because of you." Naomi, who rarely cried, who had the capacity for emotion without the conventional displays of it, felt her eyes fill in a way she did not prevent. "I know," she said, the same thing she had said on the rock by the creek, which was not dismissal but acknowledgement, the full recognition that she knew it because she felt it too, and that it required no addition. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she held it, and outside the Abilene Hotel the plains went on forever in all directions in the October dark, immense and patient and indifferent, and inside the light was warm and the wine was good, and the years they had ahead of them were many and real. There was one final significant piece of business that 1882 had left unfinished, and it concluded in a way neither of them had anticipated. In the spring of 1889, a letter arrived from St. Louis. It was from a law firm, and it informed Naomi that a group of homesteaders in Missouri whose land claims had been fraudulently redirected by the Cartwright Group, claims that had been documented in Richard's ledger and whose resolution had been part of the legal case, had been awarded a settlement. As the person who had provided the key evidence that made the settlement possible, Naomi was entitled to a portion of the legal award, which was a sum of money that was not enormous but was substantial enough to be significant. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and then she read it a 3rd time, and then she set it down and looked at Silas across the breakfast table and said, "Well." "Well," he agreed, having read it over her shoulder, "The homesteaders have their land back," she said. "They do, or some of them do, the ones who were still alive and present." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the May morning was bright and warm, and Thomas was already in the barn with the horses, doing what Thomas did every morning before school without being asked, which was to check on the horses, because he had decided at age 6 that this was his responsibility, and he had maintained it since with the specific determination that he shared with both of his parents. "I want to use it for the school," Naomi said. "The money. We don't need it for ourselves, particularly. But the school needs a library, a real library with books enough for every child in the county to find something that matters to them." Silas looked at her. He had been married to her for 7 years, and she still, regularly, did things that expanded what he understood a person could be. "Then use it for the school," he said. "Will you help me with the planning, the shelves, the space?" "Of course," he said. The library was completed in the fall of 1889. A new room added to the existing schoolhouse with shelves on 3 walls and a 4th wall of windows facing south to catch the winter light, and filled with 300 volumes that Naomi had sourced from booksellers in Kansas City and St. Louis, and once, memorably, from a boxcar of books bound for a university in Colorado that had agreed to donate their duplicates to an Abilene school library in exchange for nothing beyond a letter of acknowledgement. The children of Dickinson County came to the library with the specific hunger of children who have been given access to a resource they did not know they needed until the moment it existed. And Naomi watched them come in the particular way she watched everything that mattered, quietly and with full attention, and with the expression of someone who has put something difficult and valuable into the world and is standing back to watch it work. On the day of the library's opening, Silas stood beside her in the doorway and watched Thomas, now 6, already deep in a book about the natural history of the Kansas plains, and watched Margaret, 4, attempting to pull 3 books off the shelf simultaneously because she had decided she wanted to read all 3 at once, and the concept of sequential reading struck her as unnecessarily limiting. "Look at what you built," he said quietly. "What we built," she said. "And the homesteaders, in a way. It came from their suffering, after all. It seems right that it should become something that belongs to this place." He looked at her. The library was bright around them, the afternoon sun coming through the south windows in long gold bars, the children in it making the particular sounds of children engaged with books, which are quieter and more focused than most childhood sounds, but not entirely quiet. He thought about a train, about a gold locket on a dirty floor, about 3 states ridden in late winter on a hunch he had described to himself as practicality, and a moral obligation about returned property, when the more accurate description was that he had picked up something that had led him, by a route he could not have mapped at the start of it, to this room, this woman, this life. He took Naomi's hand. She took his. They stood in the doorway of the library they had built together and watched their children inside it, and the October light was warm on the plains, and the town of Abilene went about its particular and ordinary business around them, and there was nothing unfinished, nothing dark waiting at the edge of things, nothing left to dread or guard against. There was only this: the weight of her hand in his, the sound of their children, the long gold light, and the certain knowledge, available now to both of them, that the life they had built together was exactly what it was meant to be. The locket was around her neck that day, as it was on the days that mattered. The small turquoise ring was on her finger, as it had been since that May evening in 1883 on a Kansas prairie that had been green and wide, and full of the kind of possibility that the West had always promised, but only sometimes delivered. The words on the back of the locket, both the old words and the new ones, were true. One set had been true to a dead man who had mistaken possession for devotion. The other set was true in the way that things are true when they have been tested by time and difficulty and ordinary days, and have remained, through all of it, themselves. Silas Lawson had ridden 3 states to return something she dropped on a train. He had ridden through winter and followed her across Kansas, and stood between her and the men who wanted to use her husband's corruption against her. He had sat with her on a platform in Kansas City in the snow, and on a rock by a creek in the spring light, and on a south-facing porch under a star-filled plain sky more times than he could count. He had come home, by all of it, to her. And she had come home, too, to herself, and to him, and to this place. This wide and patient land that had asked everything of the people who came to it and given back, in the measure of what you brought to it. A life that was real and full and entirely your own. Thomas looked up from his book and saw his parents in the doorway, and raised one hand in brief acknowledgement before returning to the page, with his father's economy of gesture and his mother's absolute focus. And Margaret succeeded in removing all 3 books from the shelf simultaneously, and sat down on the floor with them, with an expression of complete satisfaction. And the light moved slowly across the library floor in the way that light moves in rooms where important things are kept. And outside, the Kansas sky was enormous and blue, and the plains went on in every direction. And in the Lawson household, in the schoolhouse library, in the house 2 miles south of town, and in the town of Abilene itself, everything was as it should be. Everything was, at last, as it should be.